Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'm Dino, and today is part 3 of our 5-part series on the DR650 electrical system. Today, we're going to talk about the starting system. So why don't you sit back, grab yourself something warm to drink, and enjoy Dino's Tinker Shed. I just can't wait to get started. I've told you I don't like electrical. See you in a minute. Well, it has probably happened to just about all of us if you've ridden a motorcycle long enough. And that is, you get up on a beautiful morning like today, you get out on your motorcycle, you hit the starter button, and you get a big fat 0. Now, even though the DR650 is a very reliable motorcycle, it's not immune to issues with its electrical system, and particularly the starter system. Like any motorcycle, these systems can sort of degrade over time and need some periodic maintenance or component replacement. Your starter system consists of multiple components that all work together to allow you to start the motorcycle and ride away and enjoy your day. These components are your starter motor, which is bolted directly to the crankcase, your starter motor relay, your clutch switch, which is located inside the lever of the clutch lever itself, the engine stop switch and starter button, which is located on the right-hand control pod, and there's also the ignition interlock system, which uses your neutral safety switch and your side stand switch to prevent you from riding away with the side stand down. It basically cuts off the ignition system and shuts the motorcycle off. It's something that many people have asked me to do a video on as soon as I started doing this series, but today we're not going to cover that. If you want me to do a side stand switch bypass video, leave a comment down below and I can do that in a future video. But today we're just going to take a look at the components of the starting system, how to test them, and how to get you back out on the road and riding. Let's take this step by step. Let's say you turn your motorcycle on and you have no power at the dashboard. You test the battery and it comes in at 13.2 volts, so you know the battery is very good. Where's the first place you're going to check? Well, for the DR650, there is a 30 amp main fuse in the system that sits on the starter relay. Take your seat off, take off your right hand side panel, and you're going to see it tucked right in there, about where your thigh would be on your right hand side. There's a white plastic cover that you take off, and inside is a 30 amp blade fuse. Pull out the blade fuse and take a look at it and see if the blade is in good condition or the fuse is in good condition or not. But go a little step further if you can. If you have a multimeter, set your multimeter to continuity and test to make sure that there is indeed continuity on that fuse. If there isn't, that's probably what your issue is. Put a brand new 30 amp fuse in there and turn on the dash and see if it works. If for some reason you don't have a multimeter, I would just go and buy a new 30 amp fuse and put it in there and test it. They're relatively inexpensive. For a couple bucks, you can rule that out pretty much and move on to the next step. That next step is something that sometimes slips the mind of even the most experienced rider, especially if you're like me and you strictly use the ignition switch to turn power on and off to the motorcycle. That is the engine start, run, stop button located on the right hand pod here. If you happen to bump that and push it in, the motorcycle will get power, and you're going to hear my LED fan in a second here on my headlight. But when you go to try to start the motorcycle, it's not going to do anything. And that's because the start-stop button disrupts power to the starting system. So you have ignition power, you have headlights, you have dashboard, all the things that you should have, but you can't actually activate the ignition switch. So the next thing I would try is to make sure that your run switch is in the proper position. And maybe that will solve the problem. I know it's rudimentary, but hey, I'm going to mention it. Well, if the fuse and the starter button itself don't resolve your problem, then you probably do have an issue somewhere within your starting system. The best place to start is at the starter assembly itself, down on the engine. It's the furthest point away from the battery in terms of the wiring diagram, and it's also the load that you're trying to initiate with the system itself. When you look at the climber's manual, it has about 4 pages dedicated to not only testing the starter, but also how to completely take it apart, test the armature, all the windings, the brushes, all that kind of stuff. And that's really good. That would be an entire show all onto itself if I wanted to show you how to do that. My experience has told me, though, that the starter either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't work, then it's probably less expensive to just buy a brand new starter either off of Amazon or eBay or even your local dealer than it would be to take it to a starter and alternator repair shop. I have sort of followed that avenue in the past. The reality is most starter repair shops don't really want to play around with the ATV and motorcycle starters. And even if they do, the parts they use all come from China now so that they can compete with buying a new starter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to verify that you have power down at the starter, and also how to test the starter when it's out of the bike. And I'm going to use a different starter, but I'll show you how to do that. The first place that we are going to look is to make sure that the starter has power. Now, I'm going to assume that you've watched the other 2 videos in this series and you understand how to use a test light or a multimeter here, because you're going to need one of those 2 devices to do the test. Basically, on top of the starter is a stud that a positive battery cable is bolted to. Now, when you push the starter button, power flows through that cable into the starter, and then the starter body itself is grounded to the engine and returns and forms your circuit, and you start the motorcycle. If you have no power or low voltage at that stud, probably there's something going on somewhere else in the starter system. So how do you test it? Well, you hook up your test light or your multimeter to the negative battery, pull back the cover that's on the starter, touch the test light or the multimeter to the stud, and then either yourself or someone else will push the starter button. The test light will light up, or you will see a voltage on the multimeter indicating that power is indeed flowing through to the starter. And if this is the case, chances are the starter is the issue, and you can pull that out of the motorcycle and replace it or repair it as needed. Or you can throw it up on the bench and you can test it to make sure that there's nothing that's really odd about it. However, if you don't get battery voltage down at the starter, the problem is further back in the system. When you do get the starter out of the motorcycle, you really should bench test it, just to make sure the issue isn't somewhere in the motorcycle with the starting clutch or with maybe some gear mesh issues, things like that. Now, I'm not going to pull my starter out, but I do have a starter that my friend Carl lent me. It's a brand new starter for his riding lawnmower. And it's a little bit different than what you're going to find on the DR650 because it has a Bendix in it that extends out and sort of catches the flywheel of the motor or the lawnmower and starts it. The DR650s looks a little different than this. It has a straight shaft here. It's always meshing with the gears, and there's a one-way clutch inside of the motorcycle that sort of allows the starter to engage the drivetrain and start the motorcycle. But we can still bench test this. The way we do this is by using the 12-volt battery, grounding the cable here, your negative battery cable, and then touching the positive post with the positive side of the battery. This has a lot of force here. It really is. It's a very powerful motor. You want to be deliberate when you test these, and you may see a little bit of arcing when you do this because you're quickly making contact with the post. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to connect my negative battery to a good ground. Now this is all painted. I could grind a little surface here, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to grab this bolt on the back. I know that's going to be a good ground. I'm going to hold the battery very tightly, and then I'll take my positive cable and I'm going to snap it onto this post. The starter motor is going to want to move, so I'm going to hold it very securely. And I'm not going to let it run for very long. I just want to make sure that it turns on, it doesn't make any funny noises, there's no smoke, nothing like that. So let's test it here. You can see that is quite a violent reaction, and it does have quite a bit of amperage running through this. It's DC volts. It's really not dangerous to do this, but you do want to make sure you do it with some authority. If you test your DR650, so you suspect the starter is bad, you pull it out of the motorcycle and you bench test it, and it just either will not turn over, it starts to smoke a little bit, or when it does turn over, it just sounds awful. More than likely, this definitely is your culprit. Order a new one, they're about 80 bucks, put it back in the bike, and that probably will resolve your issue. If you're doing this by yourself, you're going to quickly realize it's pretty tight in there on top of the battery. And honestly, moving a test light or a probe around to a positive battery stud with that much grounding around you, there is the potential that you could arc out and cause some damage to the motorcycle. There is another alternative though. If you look up here, you'll notice that the starter relay has about a 10 centimeter or 4-inch lead that comes over to it directly from the battery. It goes through the starter relay, and then there is one cable that goes directly down to the starter. You can do your test up here by touching the right side of the starter relay with your test light, and then when you do push on the starter, that should light up. For this test, to test to see if we have power down there, I have removed the power cable that feeds the starter, and I've disconnected it up here at the relay. The only reason I've done this is it's a little easier to disconnect it up here than it is off of the starter down below for this sample test. And if I left it hooked up, when I hit the starter button, well, the motorcycle's going to start, or at least the starter's going to turn over because I'm not having any issues. But it will allow me to demonstrate what you're looking for. Now, even with the ignition off, if I touch this side of the relay, you're going to see that my test light gives a good solid reading. And that's because this cable is connected directly to the battery right here. The other side of the relay at this point should be dead. So I'm going to touch that, and you can see I have no power. And that's because the relay switch itself is open right now. There's no power coming across here. However, if I hit the starter, so I'm going to turn the ignition on, you can see I still have no power. When I push down on the starter button, you're going to hear the relay click and the test light should light up. Let's see if that happens. That's exactly what we were hoping would happen. Chances are, if you have power here, whoa, there we go, see what happens. That's what happens when you work with live power. If you have power here, and your battery cable or your starter cable here is in good condition, then the problem is with your starter and it's not with any of the relay. So we've ruled out the starter and it's probably your issue. All right, I'm going to put this back together. It saves you having to probe and stick, energized wires down in an area that quite frankly is quite tight. So that is another option. But let's talk a little bit more about this starter relay and how we can test that. So here's your starter relay. And we've talked about what a relay is. It's basically a switch, an electromagnetic switch that takes a low current circuit and uses it to turn on a high powered circuit. In this case, it takes the power from your thumb, that little switch on the handlebars, and allows you to close this high-powered switch that in turn starts the engine. These can wear out, and you can test them in the bike to a certain degree just by simply using your test light, pressing the starter button, and seeing if you get power flowing across that relay. But it doesn't rule out things like the switches and stuff like that. The best way to test these is really up on the bench. To do that, I need to get this out of the motorcycle. So let's get it up onto the bench. Testing the relay really is quite simple. With it up on the bench here, we're going to need a battery and we're going to need a multimeter that you can test for ohms or continuity. To start, I'll turn on my multimeter and I'm going to set it to its continuity function. And then I'm going to test to make sure the continuity function works. I've got a red and a green wire hooked up here. I'm going to hook the green one to the black lead and the red probe to the red lead. What we're going to test here is that when power is applied to the low power or low amperage circuit, that it closes the high amperage circuit here and we get continuity between these two posts. To do this, we'll take a look at the schematic in the actual manual. What it says is the two top posts here are what trigger the high amperage circuit. Now I could try to reach in there with my battery cables here, but it's a pretty tight fit. So what I'm going to do is just use these pigtails that I made up. The negative goes on this side and the positive goes on this side. Just like that. Next, I'm going to hook up my negative side of the battery to the negative terminal, the black one. And now I can simply take this and touch it to the red terminal. And what we should hear is the solenoid click and the multimeter confirm continuity. Let's try it. This solenoid is functioning properly. If it failed to get any kind of connectivity through there, then you're going to have a problem, and this part might be your issue with your starter. It's easy to replace, and you can find these relatively inexpensively. They're, I think, $30 or $40 online. Following the starter relay, we're now going to shift our attention to 3 different components that all sort of work together to allow you to start your bike and allow the bike to run and drive away. These are your neutral safety switch, your side stand switch, and your side stand relay. And you can see them represented here on the wiring diagram, which shows you the color of the wires and somewhat where they're located on the bike. They're all underneath the seat. Let's start by testing the neutral safety switch, and we do this with the bike in neutral. Here's where the wire exits the engine, where the neutral safety switch is located, and it follows the frame rail up here to this connector. We're going to separate this connector here at this point, and we're going to test for continuity between the switch and the grounding system on the bike. So the first thing we do is we test to make sure that our multimeter is working right. Then we use one point to touch the switch and another to test a known ground, and you can see this one's working well. Next, we're going to put the bike into gear, and we're going to perform the same test. Now we should have no continuity to ground. This switch is working well. Your side stand switch is located down at your side stand, and you want to first test this with the side stand in the down position. We're going to trace the wire back up until we get to this baby blue colored connector here, which we're going to separate. Then we're going to use this end of the connector to test to see if there's any continuity here at the switch. So with the side stand down, we should have no continuity at all. So let's test this. We'll go like this and nothing, no ohms and no sound. Next, I'll use a spring clamp here to compress the switch, and this should close the circuit. Now when I test it, well, you can see I've got 4.1 ohms of resistance, which means the switch is working well. We can basically put this back together. The last component is the side stand relay located here on the left side of the motorcycle. You're going to roll back this protective rubber cover to expose the connection point right here. Disconnect this and put it up onto the bench to test the relay itself. Now, using the shop manual, there's a schematic in here that we're going to use as reference. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use our multimeter and check the continuity between the A and B terminals of the relay. The relay should not have continuity as it sits on the bench. Next, use jumper cables to connect the positive terminal of a 12-volt battery to the C terminal on the relay. Then, connect the negative battery terminal to the D relay terminal. Again, check the continuity between A and B terminals of the relay. The side stand relay should now have continuity while the voltage is applied. There should be no continuity if the battery is now disconnected. If it tests out good, replace it back in the bike and you're ready to rock. Well, if both your side stand switch and your neutral safety switch both check out the way the manual says, and you've checked the side stand relay and that's functioning correctly, there's really only one last thing to check, and that would be the switches themselves up on the controls on the handlebars. So you're going to want to check both the clutch switch the run stop button and the starter button itself to make sure that they're functioning as they're supposed to as per the wiring diagram. These are pretty simple. You're going to take off the fairing, take apart the wiring bundle that's located sort of on top of the headlight, and then find those connectors with the help of your wiring diagram and use your multimeter to make sure that you have connectivity, or continuity I should say, when the switch is activated or not. So that's probably the final phase of testing everything. There is a diode in there that works in conjunction with the side stand relay and the neutral safety switch, but I want to talk about that during the ignition portion a little bit more in depth than we are here, because it's kind of interesting how those three components work together to limit the ignition system on the bike. But for now, you should have everything tested and working well. Well, we've pretty much tested every system in the starting system of your DR650, and I hope this video was helpful. If you're still having issues with your starter, more than likely you've got a bad ground or a dead short somewhere in your wiring harness. So I would refer to part 1 of this series to learn how to test for those types of things and trace out where you probably have a rubbed wire through or something like that. But for all intents and purposes, all of your components should be working well now. If you like this series, please, by all means, leave a comment down below. Let me know what your feedback is on it, and if there's something that I've missed, I really hope that you'll put it in the comments so that not only myself, but others can learn from your experience. If you really do like the channel, please like and subscribe, and even share it with some of your friends who might find it interesting. I love to watch the subscription counts grow, and it's nothing makes me happier than to wake up in the morning and see comments that I can respond to. So please help me out in that regards. Until then, I'm going to put a few things back together and get set up for the next in the series of 5 for this particular video series. I think it's ignition is next, which is going to be challenging. So until then, you enjoy your day, and remember, tinker easy. I'll see you soon.